understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and it is time for the top 10 results of 2024 that will change your world, our world, and the whole world. John.
The results are in, and we have the top 10 most consequential events of the year. Stay tuned. Number 10.
Milei wins in Argentina in December of 2023, and in 2024 apparently has turned things around.
Number 9.
Meloni is the woman in charge in Italy and the only real leader of Europe out there.
Number 8.
Both Germany and France lose their governments.
Number 7.
The Reform Party in England and in the UK is actually the big winner in the election, not Labour.
Number 6.
Deflation takes hold in China and changes its worldview.
Number 5.
And people won't like this, but the reality is Israel is winning in the Middle East.
Number 4.
Assad is deposed, the last of the so-called socialist dictators, gone.
Number 3.
And related to the last one, a deal in Ukraine is now quite likely.
Number 2.
I know Johnny's upset about it, but it's the big news. Trump wins.
And, ladies and gentlemen, number 1.
For the year 2024, who would have thought at the start of the year that America would remain top dog, probably now more powerful than ever, but we have a new form of political government, John. It's not a democracy. It's not a plutocracy. It's a brotocracy. The regime of the bros.
Okay, pump pickers, it's time to get into it.
Anyway, so that was our top 10. This is John and I. We spent many years, every Thursday night when we were children, at about 7:20, every Thursday night on BBC One was Top of the Pops. Younger listeners will not even remember this being a thing, but ask your parents.
Well, it was an institution.
John and I sat around thinking, what was going to be number 1? And we always wanted to do, I always wanted to be Kid Jensen. And I've now just had my Kid Jensens of economics moment.
And not Jimmy Savile.
And now here, right. John, you'd be more the Davy Travis with that beard than you.
Oh, yeah,
Jensen. Anyway,
totally.
I want to talk this podcast, John, about the year that just was. We mentioned music. I want to frame it in the notion that music, culture, fashion, all those huge expressions of human interest go through what could be described as mood shifts, that suddenly the mood shifts and what we thought was impossible becomes mainstream, and what we thought was mainstream becomes really redundant. And that happens very, very, very quickly. But when it happens, you know it's happening. And you can clearly see in the last 12 months that the world has flipped on its economic, social, political, geopolitical axis. And basically, we are in a new world. Now, many years ago, they used to say, if you look back at history, that 1922 was the year the modern world began. And that was this idea that in 1922, you had the introduction of radio, you had the end of a pandemic, you had the emergence of Hitler in 1922, 1923, the putsch in Germany, you had the emergence of Mussolini, you had the ascendancy of Stalin, you had the emergence and the arrival of electricity, the arrival of the radio. All these things come together to change the world. I think historians will look back at 2024 and say, whoa, that is the year that a different world emerged. Now, it's not to say it wasn't bubbling up over the last 10 or 15 years, right? I just think it's an amazing thing. If you go back 10 years ago, John, Merkel was in power in Germany. Obama was in power in America. It was your man Cameron in England. You had Francois Hollande, who I would describe as the motorcycle seductor. Do you remember
him? He was.
He was a moped lover. He used
Yeah.
to go to his lover with his moped helmet on and go in the back and give her cakes. That was his weakness, right?
Oh, is that what you call it?
François Hollande. Anyway, he was also a member of the Socialist Party. So basically what you had was highly educated liberals who believed in the old order, who were regarded at the time like Obama and Merkel as the most important people in the transatlantic axis.
Yeah.
It's all gone. And that is, over the last 10 years, you have this change. And now, from Latin America to North America to the Middle East to Europe, we have a monumental shift in the background noise, in the background music, if you will. And therefore, the next 10 years are going to be framed by the people I mentioned, Millet, Meloni, Reform, Nigel Farage, not over by any stretch to imagine, your mate Trump, of course, right? What we're talking about is a huge change. All of Ireland was massively, and I think rightly, against Netanyahu. He has emerged on top.
Yes.
He
Well, for
has
now.
emerged as the strategist for now. But what I'm saying is now means a lot, right?
Yeah.
You look around, then you think Putin, top dog for ages. Now Russia has just experienced their Vietnam in Syria. They put all their efforts into Syria. They went in there for 9 years, and within 9 hours, the regime collapsed. And
Yeah.
now the Russians will leave. They will leave eventually. They might even leave in the next couple of days, right? That is a profound weakening of Putin's position. It shows you that the Ukraine war has sapped the Russian ability to dictate events far from home. If you think about power, the most important thing in power, really powerful countries, John, project their power very far away. And
Yeah.
the ability to project your power is what made you an empire. So when the British were an empire, they could project their power in China. They could project their power in India. They could project their power in America. They use the British Navy, right? America can project its power through, of course, the American Navy, the American Air Force, soft, hard power, the whole thing. Russia cannot now project its power outside of its own borders. And that is a huge change and a total shift to where we were a year ago. And that means that Zelensky, just by staying in the game, just by staying in the fight, will be in a stronger position over the course of the next few months. But of course, the big daddy of it all is America.
Yeah.
And the change in the tone in America. Whereas if you think about Obama and you think about Merkel and Cameron, their view was always kind of slightly appeasement. Let's project, let's de-escalate, let's try tone things down. Let's see, can we actually talk to these people? We'll talk to Putin. We'll talk to Assad. Yeah, we'll draw these red lines in the sand, as the Americans said in Syria, but we won't really act on them. And we'll try and contain China as much as we can by talking to them. What we're looking at now, John, is the opposite. This is the idea of peace through strength rather than
Yeah.
peace through
Yeah.
pleading. And so we're in a completely different world, and it's going to be a different world economically and politically, and it's really changed.
Okay, Mark. So let's start and let's dig into this a bit more. We said there that our number 10 is Millet in Argentina. Why is that? What's happened in Argentina? And tell us a little bit more about that.
Millet is number 10 because it's really quite remote. I mean, Argentina used to be a big country. It's now a very small country GDP-wise in terms of global influence. But Millet represents a complete shift, a complete mood swing change from what went before. He is a self-confessed anarcho-capitalist. He follows the words of a guy called Murray Rothbard, who made Milton Friedman look like a communist, right? This is the guy who said he's going to take a chainsaw to the bureaucracy. The most important thing is that he has managed to bring inflation down.
Yeah.
He has kept the financial markets on side and behind him, which means that bond rates in Argentina have fallen for the first time in decades. It means the stock market has risen for the first time in decades. And what you have is a sense that Argentinian money, which had been on the sidelines for so long, and when I see on the sidelines, had largely been in Miami, right,
Yeah.
is beginning to come back. Now, the downside of all this is the poverty rate, and the rate of poverty has increased dramatically. He has slashed all social welfare. He has managed to engineer a devaluation of wages by allowing the currency to devalue in his first 3 or 4 months of him being in power. But the point is, still over half Argentinians support him.
Do
And they're
they? I mean, I
prepared-
find that kind of surprising.
in the polls, yeah, he's maintained a significant buffer in the polls.
And
So I
are they
think-
the middle class or the more wealthy people, the people with money?
Well, I think it's definitely the middle class, it's the people
Yeah.
with money, it's the people with hope. I also think that he appeals to a lot of poorer people, because a lot of poorer people also know that the beneficiaries of Argentinian corruption down the years have been the broad middle class, as well as the victims.
Yeah.
So there is a sense it's nationalistic, it's all this sort of stuff. But the point is, for our top 10, John, it is a massive change in the background noise in Argentina. The fact that A, he's still in power, because most people thought he wouldn't be in power. B, through executive presidential decrees, he has managed to achieve something that people thought he could never achieve. Because remember, he has no political party. His political party is only 2 years old.
Yeah.
So he's got
He
lots
just
of
has a
opposition.
chainsaw.
He's got a chainsaw. He's got a chainsaw. Great mutton chops.
Yeah.
Great barnet. And he looks like a sort of a 1970s Rolling Stones cover band act.
Yeah. Yeah,
know?
he does. He does.
But the point is, he's still around. So that is a massive change from the old order. And I think one to be entertained as significant intellectually, philosophically. And for Argentina, the fact that he is still going ahead with his reforms. I mean, when you listen to him speak, it is kind of hilarious. But you've got to take him seriously.
Yeah. Okay, number 9 is Meloni in Italy.
Now, Meloni is a big friend of Milei. I
Yeah.
think the fact that she can speak Spanish, she can speak Italian. She's obviously from an origin party, a fascist party, the Fratelli, the Brothers of Italy. And yet, again, when she won, a bit like Milei, she was seen as a kind of an outsider, etc. She won't be able to govern Italy. Italy's too fractious. The Italians have had X amount of governments, etc., etc., etc. Not only is she still there, but 2 years after her election, she's regarded as one of the very few substantive politicians in Europe, and the Italian economy hasn't turned around, but it hasn't got any worse. So
Right.
Milei is a massive, massive shift in the perception. And this is the interesting thing, that only a liberal can be entertained by the European Commissioner. Her best mate now is von der Leyen, the head of the Commission. They're besties.
Right.
And of course, waiting in the wings is Marine Le Pen, who regards herself as a French version of Meloni, even though my sense is Meloni's a far better politician, far cleverer.
And
better
what
mover and
makes her
shaker.
good? What makes her good?
Amazing ability to build coalitions. Amazing ability.
Right.
She also is hitting the hot buttons for Italians on immigration, on the immigration from Africa. But amazingly and interestingly, she hasn't been half as tough in reality as she is in her rhetoric. So her rhetoric is still inflammatory.
Yeah.
But in reality, she is adopting a European position. And that's why her alliance with von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen, is really interesting. This is an interesting alliance to watch for the future. Again, one that us dyed-in-the-wool liberals, John, might not like, but we have to live in the real world. Not the world we would like to be, but the world as it is.
And do you think under Meloni will Italy assume much more power within Europe, given that Germany, which we're going to get onto, is on the wane?
Well, I think it's not so much that Italy will assume more power, but Italy is a founding member of the European Union. It is a founding signatory to the Treaty of Rome, 1957. It is a founding member of the Court of Justice. It's a founding. Europe can't exist without Italy. Italy is Europe. Italian culture is European culture. Everything we get is from the bloody Romans. If you
But
think
this
about
is what we used to say about Germany, though, as well.
We'll come on to Germany in a second. So all I'm just saying is watch the Italians. As I said to you before, the Italians are the cleverest in Europe, right? They're the ones who orchestrated the coup at the ECB with Mario Draghi as
Yeah.
outfoxing the Germans. They are the ones, the movers and shakers in the European Commission. Never underestimate the Italians. And now they have a leader of real operational capacity. And that's a big difference. And she can speak 4 languages, which makes her very, very amenable to chatting to others and speak them fluently.
Right. Okay. So let's get on to number 8. We mentioned Germany there and France. Both of these big powerhouses, their governments are collapsing. They're in real political trouble.
We go into the Christmas period, John, with Germany, the only country that can have a snap election that's called 17 weeks before. All right?
Yeah.
It's after. It's a 17-week snap election period.
Yeah.
The Germans are in a tailspin because their so-called traffic light coalition is a problem. So it was red, green, and amber coalition is gone. Schulz gone. New guys guy called Merz, who looks to be in pole position. CDU, Christian Democratic Union, basically the Angela Merkel party, but he looks much more like a Helmut Kohl type character than an Angela Merkel. Big changes in Germany. And again, we did a podcast in Germany a couple of weeks ago. Problem with Germany is the German economic model is breaking down. The German industrial model is breaking down. Largely, the German car industry is in trouble.
Yeah.
And when the car industry is in trouble, everything's in trouble. So Germany in a state of chassis, as Sean O'Casey would say. France, run by a lame duck president. Macron, he's gone. He's got 2 more years to run. Everyone knows he's out the door. So he's got no authority. And
Yeah.
of course, what is happening in France is you've got, the middle of the road, liberal, nice guy, social democratic Michel Barnier, the hero of Brexit, comes in. Everyone says, well, if he got Brexit done on the part of the European Commission, he will be able to keep the French Parliament on side. He gets eaten alive by our friend Le Pen. And
Yeah.
again, what's bubbling up under all this is nationalism, xenophobia, etc., etc., etc.
And the 2025 French budget that Barnier tried to introduce has been obviously scrapped. So they don't have a budget for 2025, apparently.
They're an unruly bunch, the French. Wasn't it de Gaulle who said, when he was exasperated at one of the many crises, he said, how can you govern a country with 26 versions of Camembert, right? So
That's brilliant.
France is an unruly place. I'll tell you a story. Years ago, when I worked as the economist for UBS in Paris, I was over and back from London, right? And there was a guy called Edward Balladur. Edward Balladur was a prime minister of France in, let's say, the late 1990s under the presidency of Jacques Chirac. And the most right-wing people in the world are foreign exchange traders, FX traders, right? In London, they're all like real geezers, right?
Yeah.
Or love the Tories, all that sort of stuff. You go to France and the same foreign exchange traders in the same bank, right? So in London, they love the Tories, they hate Labour, they hate trade unions. When the French National Railway, the SNCF, went on strike, when I was working there, the foreign exchange traders went on strike in sympathy with the trade
Right.
unions, right?
Wow.
That is how radical France is, and that's how different it is. So,
Yeah.
hard place to govern. That's going to be a massive, massive question mark in the weeks, months, and maybe years ahead.
Okay, so now let's go to number 7, across the channel to the UK. Reform UK being the big talking point of the UK elections.
Yeah, briefly in the UK, right? So we know the Labour Party won the election. Well, they didn't win. They won 31 or 32% of the election,
Yeah.
but they won it hands down. They've more elected MPs than ever before. Massive majority. But if you look at their share of the vote fell. So where did that go to? And of course, the Tories' share of the vote collapsed. But the Tories' share of the vote didn't go to Labour. Where did it go? It went to Farage's party, Reform.
Yeah.
So the big story is, if the British had a PR system like we do, Reform would be a massive, massive parliamentary force. Because they're the first past the post system, they are not a massive parliamentary force. But if the British electorate, and when I say British, I mean the English electorate, keeps going the way it's going, they will tip into being the party in pole position for a first past the post election, and they will be huge. That's
Yeah.
the big story. So the big story is Labour's vote falls, the Tories' vote falls, it goes to reform. And that is basically Brexit with a different head on it. And it's right wing, it's populist, it's anti immigrant, it's back to the same theme, John, all the time.
And as I mentioned on a previous podcast, Elon Musk offered the Reform Party 100 million to campaign.
Well, I'm back to this idea, John, of the Bro-tocracy. So Nigel Farage is the lad's lad. I'd never met a bigger lad. He's a total lad.
Yeah, he
drinking
is, yeah.
pints, all that sort of. He is part of the Bro-tocracy himself. Musk,
Or he's a
Trump,
wannabe anyway.
No, he is one. He's the most consequential politician in Britain in the last 15 years. He has shifted Britain out of the EU. You mightn't like him, but you can't underestimate him.
Yeah.
He's still there and he's still important. So this is where the Bro-tocracy comes back in. The Bro-tocracy Meloni.
Yeah.
She's obviously not a bro, but she's part of the Bro-tocracy. Farage, all that sort of stuff.
Well, we'll get to the Bro-tocracy in a moment. But now, number 6, which was Chinese deflation. Talk to me about that.
So Russell Napier talked to about us the other day, right? It's something we've been watching for a while, which is the fact that China has gone from a deflationary source for the world, which is hugely important, to an inflationary source. Why is that? It's because China is going through deflation, right? Prices are falling, capital expenditure is falling,
Yeah.
property prices in particular are falling. That is going to prompt the Chinese to try and expand, which means increasing wages, trying to, in some way, make its own people rich. Now, what does that do? Is it increases inflation around the world, right? Because the source of much of our deflation for the last 20 years was cheap Chinese stuff. That era is over. But more importantly, what it does is it changes the mood in Beijing, because it's gone from a mood of unbelievable confidence when the economy is growing to a mood of self-criticism, anxiety, now that the economy isn't doing well. So China is going to present itself as quite a different creature economically, politically, etc. Big, big story, a continuation of what was the case for the last couple of years, but most people believed this year, 2024, was the year China would turn it around. It hasn't done so.
Yeah. Number 5, Israel winning.
Now, again, very, very unpopular in Ireland, but Netanyahu, he's on trial in Israel at the moment for corruption.
Yeah.
He has already been found by the International Criminal Court to be a potential war criminal. If he leaves Israel, he will be arrested by the signatories of the International Criminal Court, which is basically everybody that counts except the United States, right?
Yeah.
But this time 12 months ago, the perception was Bibi Netanyahu was on the way out. Right now, he is. The man the Israelis think has won in Gaza, has beaten Hamas, has won in Lebanon, has won in Syria, has basically looked at the Iranians and said, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, and the Iranians have backed down. He has destroyed the coalition against him. Now, we all know that the price of that has been a genocide in Palestine.
Yeah.
Whether it's semantics, whether you call it genocide or not, it is the mass murder of women and children. But in the world of geopolitics, Israel's winning. And that is something, whether you like it or not, is a massive piece of news. And it's a massive event, and it's a massive turn up, because it'll affect the Middle East for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
And then, of course, related to that is our number 4, which is the end of the Assad regime, and therefore possibly the weakening of Putin and Russia.
Not only possibly, John, definitely the weakening of Putin and Russia. So what we have, the Assad regime, we don't have to go back over it. This is a regime that is 50 years old. It collapses what it looks like in 5 days, right?
Yeah.
Why it happened, who's coming in, that's not for this podcast. What's for this podcast is what it does to the relationships globally, right? So Assad is the last of the what was called the Ba'ath socialist governments, right? So that was Nasser in Egypt, That was, and again, the successors of Nasser in Egypt.
Yep.
That was Saddam Hussein in Iraq. That was Gaddafi, although he wasn't Ba'ath, was the same sort of idea. It was an anti-imperialist, anti-Western, slightly pro-Russian, and slightly socialist, but unbelievable dictators. So you've got two types of, and it's a very interesting observation, right? You have two types of rulers in the Middle East. You have monarchies and dictators.
Yeah.
The monarchies are still there. Morocco, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. For some reason, the kings and queens have provided, they've been smarter. The king of Jordan is still there.
Yeah.
All the dictators, Gaddafi, Saddam, Assad, are gone. So, question for 2020, don't rule out the kings. They're not that stupid, right? But what it does is it changes profoundly the relationships in the Middle East. I would not be surprised if the end of Assad betokens or suggests the end of the regime in Iran in some shape or form in the next 12 months. It's a big call, but I think that's probably the long-term consequence. Why? Because Putin profoundly weakened. Putin profoundly weakened means Iran's major sponsor is profoundly weakened. And as I said before, the fact the Russians can't project their power abroad means they are on the back foot. We said it was Russia's Vietnam. I think this is exactly what we're talking about. So we have Assad together with Putin weakening at number 4, and that changes the world ahead simply because it's a massive shift from the last 12 months.
Okay, so we're now left with the top 3. So let's come back to those after this break. So we're doing a countdown of the top 10 of the extraordinary events of 2024. And we're down to the final top 3. Number 3 is possibly a new deal in Ukraine. Talk to me about that.
So anything that weakens Russia and Putin strengthens the hand of the Ukrainians in what looks to be a new dispensation. Fascinatingly, the perception was Trump was going to give Ukraine away to Russia. That now doesn't look like the case at all. In fact, what Trump now is kind of suggesting is that he is going to orchestrate. Now, his big move for the first 4 or 5 weeks of his presidency would be to preside over a deal in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, I suggest that what has happened over the last while means that the Ukrainians are in a better position if they can just hold out. There is a reason the Russians are bombing incredibly heavily at the moment. It is to try and get themselves in a position of ascendancy before a deal is done. If Russia was still the main power broker in the Middle East, if Iran was still unleashed in the Middle East and strong, there would be a sense that Russia is in a much more formidable position.
Yeah.
Now, it is clear that Russia is on the back foot. And this means that the Ukrainians, if they can just hold out physically and mentally, that when they get to the table, there may well be a deal that might come quicker than we expect.
But it's interesting, though, that I was just reading recently that the Kremlin have said that Trump's thinking is in line with their thinking. I don't know what that means, but
I think they're bullshitting.
Yeah.
I think that Russians will use a ceasefire or a peace treaty to buy time for the next move. They don't see it as the end of the game. They see it as a long process.
Yeah.
They're going to string it out. They're going to accuse the Ukrainians, the Americans of doing this, that, and the other. But if Trump can do a deal with China and say to the Chinese, don't get involved, if there's a trade-off with the tariffs, because the Chinese want no tariffs. If Trump says, look, we said 30%, well, we give you 15% of the tariffs, right? He said that's the way he thinks, right? And he can keep the Chinese out of the negotiations. Then there's a very good chance that the Ukrainians will get a deal, not a deal that doesn't demand that they don't cede territory. They'll have to cede territory. But Zelensky's already said they'll cede territory. But I'm just thinking the mood has changed because of Assad.
Right.
And that's number 3.
Okay. And speaking of the art of the deal, number 2, Trump himself, the Time Person of the Year.
Yes, I saw that by far and away the biggest event of the year is the re-election of Donald Trump after having been 4 years in the wilderness, building up the base again. He wins, we know, emphatically, not that he won a huge proportion of the popular vote above Kamala Harris, but he won where it counted.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, he's back in the White House. It's the big news. He is the puppet master of all the Malays and the Melonis and all the various things. If he wasn't in power, none of this would have half the consequence it has. But because he is the person behind the Netanyahus, he is the man that everybody wants to be friends with. This is the key. And he is going to anoint it. This is very important for Ireland.
Yeah.
Because we spent our official Ireland, right? The Irish bureaucracy spent the last 4 years thinking that we could cryogenically freeze Joe Biden and just have him embalmed as president for the next, 10,000 years, right?
Yeah.
Now we need to get down and dirty with the Republicans and the MAGA crowd. But that's the big news. There's no bigger news.
And that leads us to number 1. And number 1, Trump himself is inheriting this really strong economy.
A, it's a strong economy. B, it is an economy that has given its president a license to do what he wants. 3, what he wants is different to anything that went before. It's isolationism. It's anti-immigration. It's tariffs. It's basically escalating. And this is the key. It's escalating in order to achieve peace. And that's the massive shift from what went before, where your Bidens and your Obamas and your Merkels and your Camerons were all about de-escalation. This guy is going for massive escalation, and that changes the world. And the second thing, as part of our first number 1 change, America is back in big style. But this idea, John, which is of the Bro-tocracy, is a new concept. So what you have across the board is a bunch of wealthy bros. It's like, for example, this is like if Joe Rogan took over democracy. This is basically what you're looking at. And the mood has changed. It's not just Musk. It's the secretary, the treasury secretary, it's the defense secretary, it's the education secretary. All these people reflect the MAGA movement, which is a bro movement. And so there's been, I think, a pretty unpleasant shift towards masculinity.
Yes.
And in the past, it means that, for example, what was described as woke is now very much gone as the vogue ideology of the present. It is something that will be consigned to the past. And what we're going into is the brotocracy, which is quite different. So I come back to it, John. We'll end it up here. People look in history and say 1922 was the year the modern world started. I think 2024 was the year that something massive changed in the world, and we will live, hopefully to tell the tale, but we'll certainly live over the next year or two on this podcast to tell the story.